Ukraine's president is calling for the country's parliament to be dissolved after lawmakers refused to label the self-declared independent authorities in the East terrorist organizations. More now from the Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris, John Laughland. Thank you so much, John, for joining us here on RT International. Well, Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, called some of the parliamentary factions a fifth column that undermined the government's policies. And the communists, as we know, recently were ousted from the parliament. What do you make of this? I mean, is this some sort of a political lynching going on there?
Of course there is. And, you know, how ironic, because the Maidan revolution, the Euro-Maidan revolution, as I'm sure you and your viewers remember, was predicated on the idea that the president's powers, the powers of the president of Ukraine, should be drastically reduced in favor of those of the parliament. And at the very moment when President Yanukovych was overthrown on the 21st of February, the very next day, the parliament voted itself new powers in terms of going back to the 2004 constitution. Now, the new president, Poroshenko, discovers that actually this new constitution doesn't suit him, and he needs to purge the parliament. He needs to stigmatize people who don't agree with his policies as fifth columnists. He needs to ban the Communist Party, as you said in your question. And above all, he and his cronies, the government itself, the Prime Minister and the other ministers, they are, of course, trying to rig the elections by changing the electoral law in advance of the polls so that they get the parliament they want. It's obvious that this is worthy of a banana republic. This is not worthy behavior of a European state.
All right, speaking of the parliament that they want, what sort of parliament are we likely to see? I mean, is it going to be more obedient? Who is it going to be comprised of? What's your take?
It's difficult to say. I mean, obviously, a large answer to that, a large part of the answer to that question depends on what will happen to the Party of the Regions. It was decapitated in February. It hasn't yet found a new leader who is capable of taking things forward. Part of its electorate doesn't want to belong to Ukraine anyway and is engaged in a civil war. But that will be the decisive factor. To what extent will the former Yanukovych party be able to pull itself together and fight the elections in any meaningful sense? Obviously, the new power will put every single obstacle in its way. But I think one of the other interesting things about the latest developments and these remarks that you're reporting about Poroshenko is that, of course, and by the way, I congratulate you on concentrating on internal Ukrainian politics, because in the Western media, the Ukrainian issue is presented entirely in terms of the fight against Russia. But it's very important to emphasize, as we saw in last week's fake resignation of Yatsenyuk, the Prime Minister, that there are, of course, divisions not only between East and West, between pro- and anti-Russians in Ukraine, but also within the pro-Western faction itself, between the Udar, the Svoboda, and the Fatherland parties. And we know from the Orange Revolution in 2004 that coalition fell apart after a year or so. Will the same thing happen this time round as well? That's one of the other things we need to watch.
Well, you know, John, interestingly, you mentioned that it was a fake resignation by Yatsenyuk, country's prime minister. But what do you actually make of it? I mean, was it a PR stunt there, or what was he sort of aiming to get out of all this?
Well, I think basically a lot of Ukrainian politics is explained by money. And obviously the war is costing money. Ukraine is on the brink of default. And some of the political parties who are controlled by oligarchs, and let's never forget the role of oligarchs is absolutely key in Ukrainian politics, perhaps started to cut up a bit difficult about paying for this war. Yatsenyuk, when I say fake resignation, it was a classic parliamentary maneuver in the sense that he made the voting of new money for the war a matter of confidence, and he therefore put his own job on the line and thereby managed to get these dissident parties back on board. Let's see how long that lasts. Let's see how long it takes, for this heteroclite coalition to stay in place. It didn't last long in 2004. It fell apart after a year and a half. It may well last for another few months in Ukraine, but the long-term prospects, we'll have to wait and see what happens.
Well, absolutely, John. We're keeping our eyes on it. And with us was John Laughland, Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation in Paris. Thanks so much for your views.